What's up, man? It's been a while since we've done one of these. For those of you bored enough to actually listen to this, normally I'm kind of a gearhead and we have real mics and stuff, but we are going straight Skype today, so there's going to be a little echo, and we hope you guys will just bear with us. But I'm Jordan Rogers, and I'm here with John Tobben. What's up, Tobin? How's it going, man?
It's going well, man. Just good weekend. Went to the Carolina Wake game, so now just back Winston-Salem, taking it easy.
So we haven't done, like I said, we haven't done one of these in about 18 months, but this last night obviously kind of spurred us into action. Probably one of the most exciting single games in ACC basketball since I don't know the Hansborough Henderson incident, JJ Senior night. I mean, this is up there, right?
I mean, definitely one of the more controversial ones. It's really been kind of a crazy week when you think about it. It's funny because in about 30 minutes, Pitt plays at Florida State, the ACC Sunday night game, and Pitt's actually been off since they played Carolina, which was just last Saturday, but it feels like weeks ago, months ago even. Just because both with the postponement of the Carolina Duke game, both Carolina and Duke ended up playing 4 games in 8 days. So Carolina's played 3 games since they played Pitt, and Pitt's playing their first one since then. So it's been a crazy week. But yeah, last night was kind of, I guess, an interesting cap to it. It was a good game. I got to watch it probably about the majority of the second half and about half of the first half. But the way it ended, I mean, it's not as much surprising that it ended with a controversial call, but obviously the way it went down was pretty legendary.
We'll get into the kind of the narratives here, but first question: do you think it was Boeheim's response was calculated or just kind of spur of the moment?
Um, I
Well,
think
I guess the better way of wording that is clearly he couldn't have planned something like that happening. Do you think he went into that game thinking this is my first time showcasing my program in the ACC on national television? Do I need to? You think in the back of his head he was thinking, if something goes down, I'm going to make a stand here, make a show of it, or do you think the moment after he did it, he said, "Holy shit, what am I doing? I just embarrassed myself in one of the bigger games my program's ever played in."
no, I mean, I don't know. I think we briefly texted about this. I'm not sure you got to watch the post game press conference, but he seemed pretty smug about the whole thing. As far as getting ejected, he even said, they asked him whether he thought him getting ejected hurt the team's chance of winning. Because they were only down 2, and it was a player control foul, so Duke wasn't even necessarily shooting right after that play. But he said, he thought the game was over after that. My guess is that he maybe even saw. I don't think he intended to get kicked out of the game until that very moment. But I think he knew there'd be a chance that Duke would get a favorable call in Cameron. I think in that moment he was, maybe it was kind of a calculated thing to say, look, I'm going to make a big stand about this so that it is a huge controversy that Duke got a call instead of just, standard ACC fare.
It was tough for me to gauge because I actually kind of missed about 6 minutes to a minute left, so I didn't have a good frame of reference for maybe. Clearly it was a 2 point game, so it was intense, but I had nothing to really judge it on. All right, so to me there are three parts of this. There is just the Syracuse Duke rivalry moving forward. I mean, this is their Henderson Hansborough moment, and Kay and Boeheim are pretty close friends. I think that's a key part of this. I'm sure they talk to each other on the phone after that, or maybe today or something like that. Then there is the Boeheim becoming a hero for kind of state fans and the anti-Carolina Duke crowd for just taking a stand against K, or be it in the Dean Dome against Carolina, kind of the same thing to that group. And then you have the general discussion over the block and charge, which is, we're going on 2 or 3 years of what seems like this getting pretty out of control. And we thought a lot of this was going to get fixed coming into this year with I forget the exact rules they put in place, but that was supposed to be, one of the points of emphasis for referees was to fix this. And it obviously just hasn't happened. I don't know if you've seen the Vine that I tweeted a few times that was the foul on Jabari, or the foul on Gabenji that or Benajay that Jabari picked up, and then the one at the end, obviously the exact same play. It was actually uncanny how similar they were. And, the refs called it both ways. And my thing, I honestly, they probably made the right call there at the end. In reference to the rules, but that's what bugs me is that I think it's just an awful rule.
So
But yeah, go ahead.
yeah, so we'll start with the last point, the one you're talking about, as far as the actual call. At first when I first saw the play, I immediately had the Jim Boeheim reaction too. That Syracuse just got shafted. And I saw the replay, and it probably, with the way the new rules are, it should have been a block, not a charge. And then especially when you compare it, even Boeheim in his post-game presser mentioned the comparison of that Benajay play. So there's definitely the inconsistency aspect of it, but it wasn't just a blatantly horrible call. Like, Duke has gotten much worse calls. Actually, I would argue, and this is a point we could get into more if you want, but I'd argue that Duke's getting away with hand checking on the perimeter over the past couple games, which are Syracuse and the Carolina game, is way more egregious than that call. And I actually have a couple thoughts on that. One is that you kind of expected that these hand check rules, just because Duke's always been, a team that overplays and hand checks on the perimeter, you kind of had a feeling that as the ACC season went on, there would be some selective enforcement and Duke would be able to get away with that a little more in big games, which is proving to be the case. The other thing that I think is interesting, though, is I don't know if it's a perception or not. I at least kind of have this perception that Duke sometimes struggles when they get in the tournament because they've gotten, I don't want to say completely biased, but maybe somewhat favorable reffing in the ACC, and then suddenly they get in the NCAA tournament and don't get quite as many calls. And I kind of wonder, especially, maybe with the block charge rule as well, but especially with the hand checking, if all of a sudden they're going to start getting those called when they get in the tournament, and it could be a big problem for them getting in foul trouble because, Suleiman, Thornton, and Cook had their hands on people on the perimeter all throughout the Syracuse game and even a good bit during the Carolina game.
Well, let's preface this by not sounding too biased. I think Carolina gets a lot of that benefit. Now, I think there are a few reasons why things in Cameron get taken to another level, and I don't even think that's on Duke. Man, you've talked about this, that I think there are statistics that show the closer the crowd is to the court, the more biased the refs are. But I think Carolina gets that benefit too. But Carolina doesn't play that overplay defense, which if you're going to let teams get away with stuff, clearly that overplay gives Duke a huge advantage. And then if you let their help defenders step in and take charges, then they don't have a shot blocker. That's kind of their only really caveat on defense. Then you almost have an unstoppable defense in that sense. But yeah, it probably hurts them. I'm kind of torn on this because I think Carolina, Duke, Kansas, Kentucky, even UCLA to a degree, just they're going to get calls. And it's weird that Syracuse, who kind of is on the cusp of being one of those blue bloods, but just isn't, and you feel like Syracuse doesn't get them, even though, they've had number one rankings about 5 years in a row now.
I think state fans would beg to differ on Syracuse not getting calls.
Well, let's not say one or two, but I'm talking about I think systematically Carolina and Duke get more calls every game, just kind of year in and year out.
I definitely agree. And I think my point with the hand checking is just it's a certain thing that would probably affect Duke more than others just because of the way they guard on the perimeter. But yeah, no, I think getting back to the call, at the end of the Syracuse Duke game, I don't think it was the worst call I've ever seen. It probably should have been either a no call or a block and one, but it's kind of funny. I guess the rest of the ACC also has a feeling, and it would probably be the same thing if, Syracuse had lost at Carolina in a similar fashion. But the rest of the ACC just seems somewhat bemused about this whole thing and not as outraged. Just kind of saying, welcome to ACC, Syracuse. This is what you should have expected.
I thought state fans' reaction was fantastic. Just, we've been dealing with this for 20 years or however long you want to go back with Duke basketball. Kind of coming around. But there is this weird trifecta of, I think, Ovia's piece was essentially this morning that, he had already become an ACC legend. And I would use the word hero because you have this trifecta of hero to state fans for taking a stand against the, kind of Duke Carolina in general. Hero to Carolina fans for doing it against K specifically, and a hero to Duke fans for giving them the damn game, because obviously that did effectively end the game.
No, it's great because he's an interesting personality too to mix between the Roy and K are obviously the two kind of preeminent figures in the ACC, and both of them in some ways their perception is almost a caricature of themselves. Roy obviously has the whole daggum Roy perception. And then K obviously has a perception of just being, cussing every game, yelling at refs, all that stuff. And both of them are based in some truth, but it's kind of funny, everyone just knows what to expect out of those two. Whereas Boeheim, people know Boeheim, but at least within the ACC frame of reference, he's somewhat of a fresh face, as much as someone who's been coaching for 30 years can be a fresh face. But he has enough, I guess, gravitas or importance himself that it's not like if Mark Gottfried or Jim Larinaga, both, Larinaga at least is a very good coach. It's not like if they do something outrageous. Boeheim doing something outrageous, he's enough of a legend himself that it garners more attention, which is interesting just because from a coaching perspective, the ACC has been dominated by, Kay and Roy, and before that, Kay and Dean Smith for so long.
Boeheim, he's a tough guy to read. I was really surprised last night. I've never really seen him do that. I think he's only been tossed once. I mean, it was like 15 years ago. I mean, Roy and Kay do this consistently. Roy could have got a tech against Duke Thursday night when I think Page kind of got hit on a layup when Carolina was really struggling there in the second half. But I mean, this is going to be awesome. This was the main storyline over the summer was Boeheim entering the ACC. He's been talking smack about the ACC tournament, Greensboro, the Denny's comment, and it all came to fruition in the most spectacular way possible on national TV. We gave ESPN all kinds of shit for blowing this game out of proportion, but did they? I mean, this is going to be one of the preeminent games for at least the next 5 years. If not, I mean, who knows what happens to those programs after those guys leave. But this was awesome. And my question to you, so now, what is going to happen in Greensboro? I mean, this just boils over. Hopefully these two guys play each other.
Yeah, I mean, as a Carolina fan, so I have my obviously selfish biases, but it would be great for Carolina if they can end up on the same half of the draw as Virginia with Duke and Syracuse on the other side. So they wouldn't have to play, except for one of those two. Also, it'd just be great to see them play each other. Now, I guess some people would love to see those two play in the finals of the ACC tournament, which, to be fair, would be a good game. But man, I mean, Virginia is, hasn't lost in forever. Their only ACC loss was a really close game at Duke, which we just saw. It's not even very good teams have a hard time winning there. They're sneakily really good. They kind of have the perfect. It feels like the first time that coach Bennett has had that perfect type of team for his style, where he actually has enough players who can make shots consistently and be an offensive threat that when they're slowing it down, they're not. They can kind of go on scoring runs still. Because I mean, Joe Harris, he hasn't been quite the superstar people expected, but he's very reliable, and they've got a couple good shooters. They've got good rebounders. I mean, Virginia's a good team. Duke has been playing really well. They lost to Carolina, but it's a rivalry game. Carolina's obviously on a really hot streak, and Syracuse, they lost 2 games in a row, but they're still 25-2 or whatever their record is. So, I mean,
While we're looking at the top 4 seedings to the tournament, so Virginia's 14-1. Cuse has 2 losses, and Virginia and Cuse actually play each other again.
Play at Virginia.
Yeah, I'm guessing Virginia wins out. Cuse has kind of a tough schedule, but I'm kind of let's just assume they both win out, except clearly one of them has to lose that game. If they tie, if Syracuse wins, then I think it's their record against Duke, which would favor Syracuse because they beat them once.
I think it'd be head-to-head, wouldn't it, if they tie?
Well, their head-to-head would then be split, I think, right? Or
no, they only play once.
Okay, so if Cuse wins that, Cuse will get the 1 seed. So we're probably looking at Syracuse 1, Virginia 2, and Duke and Carolina. I think that'll come down to whoever wins that last game.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, and we'll get to it in a second, but Carolina only really has one somewhat of a hurdle, speed bump before their Duke game, which is at State this week, and we'll talk about that in a bit. But, they have a very good chance to win out until the Duke game. And, Duke, I don't think has an overly challenging schedule before Carolina either. So, yeah, the second game in Cameron could end up deciding that, which it always seems like it is deciding. It's funny. Usually it feels like it's deciding the 1 or 2, but it always seems like it has some impact on, which team is seated higher than the other.
I'm still looking at this potential Syracuse-Duke matchup. That's just going to be fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, you have to hope.
If Carolina beats Duke, then you'd have them as the 1 and 4. If not, they would not be able to play till the championship game.
Yeah. But it seems like it's likely that Duke and Carolina wouldn't play until the championship game, which I mean also would be fantastic. I feel like, although I don't know, the Duke Carolina matchups in the ACC tournament always feel kind of weird. In a weird way, Syracuse Duke would feel more exciting and less weird to me.
Well, Brett Strelo was talking about the difference between those two games, actually, Duke, Syracuse, Carolina, Duke, and was basically saying, yeah, exactly what you are, that everyone's sphincter is so tight during a Carolina Duke game that it's almost tough to enjoy. When you throw another one on the mix like that, it's nice for kind of the national audience, but I almost think Duke and Carolina fans would kind of skip that. But man, it's gonna be a cluster, man, and that's gonna be interesting in Greensboro. It's too bad I'm not covering it this year because I think that's gonna be a lot of fun. A lot of great press conferences, 5 days of that. So does ESPN carry any of those? Is that all local? I forget. Does ESPN normally kind of pick up the Saturday and Sunday games?
God, I'm not sure. I feel like Raycom does a lot of it, but ESPN might cover. I think they use. To be honest, I'm not sure. I can't remember what the deal is, and I know ESPN now has a deal with the ACC, so
It'll probably be on both.
Yeah, I would think so.
Come Saturday, it'll probably be on both.
Yeah.
Um,
Can we quickly talk about Greensboro as because this is something that's come up. We haven't. It's not necessarily newly topical, but just something since you're from Greensboro.
Yeah. What do you want to know?
I was talking with my dad. So this isn't the whole. Obviously, there's the people who say it should be in Madison Square Garden every year, which I do think they should play it there occasionally. But North Carolina is, even with the addition of other schools, still kind of the heart of the ACC in some ways. But I don't know, with downtown Charlotte blossoming and with the new Bobcats Arena being a very good venue for this kind of thing, is there an argument to be made that instead of Greensboro, they should just play it in Charlotte every year, the years they have it in North Carolina?
There is. I think in pure ticket sales, you're just not going to beat Greensboro. I've always wondered I'm not aware of the massive revenue source for the ACC. Is it more so actual ticket sales? Is it more so from kind of the whole event, which I think might be a little bit bigger in Charlotte? But ticket sales have to be maximized in Greensboro just because you have just geographically it makes perfect sense. You might have a lot of guys from Maryland, Virginia, DC, and things like that don't want to make the trip that extra 2 hours down to Charlotte. I don't really know how that goes. I mean, I think it did well in 07 and 08 when Carolina won both of those. But I don't know what goes into the league's thought process with that. Sometimes I wonder if Greensboro is a legacy thing, but as cool as Madison Square Garden would be, I would think you'd have a lot of trouble selling it out. Unless you had people in New York who just got excited for, Duke, Carolina, Syracuse, and things like that, which probably not. If we do that, it should be once like every 5 years. I guess we'll see where that goes. Let me look that up right now and see if they planned any of those out.
Yeah. Well, while you're looking, basically, one of my friends made this point, and he's actually a Pitt fan. I actually went to the Carolina Pitt game with him. But, he made the point that Madison Square Garden, it's not even just the fact it's at MSG, which is a cool arena for sure. But it's more the fact that, like, in between the, first couple sessions and the afternoon sessions, everyone goes out in New York City. And it's just more of a place to go out aside from the tournament itself. Obviously, Stamey's is awesome, but outside of that, Greensboro isn't quite, a vibrant city as much.
Oh, there is zero to do in Greensboro. ABC rated it the least sexy town in America this last year, which tells you a little bit about the nightlife. You can read into that as you need. So I'm looking at it right now. The next two, including this year, are in Greensboro. The one after that's in DC, and there's nothing scheduled after that. I guess they'll probably be opening it back up to bids or however they work it. I know the ones in Florida have just been terrible.
Yeah, Florida.
Atlanta's in play. I guess you're looking at Atlanta, DC, Charlotte, and Greensboro as your potential venues.
Like a 4-city rotation, and you could even alternate between Greensboro and Charlotte, but a 4-city rotation of Atlanta, DC, Charlotte, and New York City would be fun. I don't agree. I think those are all fun enough cities that having it, anyone arguing it should be just in Charlotte or just in New York City, I feel like that's not a valid argument. I think it's more fun to kind of change up the cities because those are all very, fun, interesting cities that could accommodate the, such a big event.
Well, we are thinking about it in terms of fans. And like I said, so of course there's more to do in New York. for a fan once you go out, but the ACC doesn't see a lot of those sales at bars that they don't own and restaurants they don't own and things like that. So I don't even know if that goes into their thinking necessarily. Now, if it's more of a national showcase of the conference, then I guess it's got to be New York. I don't really know what the thought process on that is.
Yeah. Well,
it might depend a little bit on how good the league's doing. But I guess there's no way to gauge that.
I guess the point too with New York is really, I mean, you think about the ACC tournament too. Some other fan bases travel okay, but really Duke and UNC, and probably Syracuse now to an extent as well, are going to carry that conference. Louisville once they get added as well. Notre Dame has a good fan base. Pitt has a surprisingly good fan base. Clemson even has, for a school that's not necessarily great at basketball, has a pretty solid fan base. UVA, but I mean, just as far as traveling, I think it's still going to mainly be those top tier programs that have the fans that will be traveling anywhere. And I don't think you're going to have a hard time getting Carolina and Duke fans to go to any of those four cities.
Well, plus the thing about Carolina is you have fans everywhere. And you're just talking about a brand that's been around so long that there's so many generations of fans. Yeah, you're going to have a ton of fans living in New York already. I think that's the thing I noticed the most when Carolina goes on the road is you have a huge contingent of fans who've been living there and been dying for Carolina to come for 5 or 10 years. But all right, so you started talking about fan bases, and two things on that. One, that's why I'm okay with ESPN hyping this Syracuse Duke thing, because you do have two different fan bases kind of getting to know each other. And you saw in the broadcast, they're going over some pretty obvious facts to most ACC fans, but may not be to a casual Syracuse fan who's legitimately never watched a game at Cameron Indoor and things like that. But all right, so you mentioned that I've heard things about Pittsburgh's fan base, that they travel very well. Is that really true about Syracuse? I wouldn't know.
I have no idea. I mean, I'm not even sure. I don't know how well. I would assume they travel fairly well. I mean, they're the Steelers fans, which is different, but are historically great for traveling well. And I mean, they're Pitt fans, at least of Pitt basketball. They might not have a huge fan base, but they have a pretty passionate fan base and a pretty loyal fan base. So I think for events like the ACC tournament and stuff, they'd show up.
I guess we'll find out here in a month or 3 weeks.
Yeah. The other thing is kind of back to the Syracuse Duke rivalry thing. It is interesting. I think I guess you said Strelo was the one who made this point initially, but you bring up a good point that even if Carolina fans are cheering against Duke, or even like Duke fans in Syracuse, there's not quite the stakes that there is with Syracuse Duke as there is with UNC Duke, and I don't mean that in the sense of rankings or standings or anything like that. I mean it only in the sense that we all know Duke or Carolina fans around us, so you're going to hear shit talk after the Carolina Duke game. There's just stakes as far as seeing the people who are Duke fans and hearing about it. I mean, I'm sure there's some overlap between the Duke and Syracuse fan bases, especially in the Northeast, but it's not. It feels just more like a continual matchup of good basketball, where you just kind of appreciate the good basketball as opposed to the rivalry overshadowing the basketball at times.
Yeah, I mean, a little bit of that is, I don't mean this into your point, but just is obvious that there's no history there, and that's a little bit of the old guard, has been complaining about Maryland leaving and just bringing in all these new schools. Is you don't have that, and I thought about maybe writing about this. Obviously, I talked to you about that a little while ago. That people are just not that interested in Duke Syracuse on that kind of cultural level. And that might be kind of a problem here going forward. Now, I mean, as much of a cliche it is, you do have a lot of Duke fans from up north, and that's where Syracuse is. And there could be a little bit of that. But, to your point, Carolina beat Duke 3 days ago. Pretty big win for Carolina. Haven't had a surprise over Duke like that in a while. And because I don't know a lot of Duke fans, that definitely took something out of it. Back in high school, you show up at school the next day, you have 100 people to talk shit to. And without that there, it definitely takes things down a notch.
Yeah, I mean, so it's a different scenario for me because I'm in medical school at Wake Forest, and I have a bunch of Duke grads. Actually, I know more Duke people now than I did in high school or college. So for me, I see people and talk to them. So there's maybe even added stakes. Maybe the rivalry's even intensified a bit more for me. I mean, I've talked about this too, and I don't want to get too distracted on this point, but it's interesting too because most Duke fans are Duke grads that I know are not that obnoxious. They like Duke, and that's annoying. But they probably think the same thing about me liking Carolina. Um, I think they just have a fan base where among their grads and among their fans, it's probably like 20-25% of them, but they just that 20-25% so strongly fulfills every stereotype we have that it kind of keeps it going in a endless cycle there. But yeah, no, I mean, I was extremely excited about the Carolina Duke game. I think it was almost bigger for Carolina, and I think I mentioned this point too. For the rivalry, and I know a lot of it was done kind of in a trolling sense, but the relevance of the Duke Carolina game, especially with the Syracuse Duke game right after, um, for the rivalry, I feel like it was great for Carolina to win. I feel like if you're taking my Carolina fandom aside from it, I feel like the best thing that could happen was for Carolina to win that game because Carolina's, they'll be ranked this week. If they do, sweep the games up until the next Duke game, they're probably going to be top 15 going into that Duke game. Duke's obviously going to still be ranked high, especially after beating Syracuse. So suddenly that second matchup is now looking like a matchup between two top 15 teams, which is nice because the past couple meetings, Carolina's been unranked.
So while we're looking ahead, Carolina and State playing 3 days. State's been on a little bit of a roll. They're okay. They're actually right behind UNC in the ACC standings. Still kind of fighting for a NCAA tournament berth. But all right, so since Julius Hodge left Raleigh, and a little bit, that's kind of when Hansborough came to town, State has not even competed with UNC. I mean, none of these games are even, in single digits, with the exception of Sidney Lowe's first game. And the game last year that, State hadn't won in a while, Carolina was really down. And both of those going into them, you felt like this was kind of a game of destiny for the Pac. This is the Pac's game. And they came out and won both of those from the get-go. Every other game has been a total joke, essentially. Not even competitive, not even that fun to watch. This one feels like it could be a little different because of how much State needs it. They've been playing well, but at the same time, I expect them to just lay down. I've just seen it too much, and they're going to have to prove me wrong here sooner or later.
Well, yeah, it's interesting because kind of like you said, the Sidney Lowe game, I remember it was my freshman year of college, and I felt like that one was just one where Carolina had a team that was better than State, but they had a young team that you just kind of could tell was overlooking that game and didn't. State came to play and Carolina didn't, and they ended up winning. Last year's game was a little different because by the time we got to last year, Carolina was on something like a 17-0 run against State, something obscene. And you kind of had a feeling that given where Carolina was at that time last year, and given that State was still, they hadn't gone into full collapse mode yet that season, you kind of had a feeling State had a very good chance to win the game. They ended up doing so kind of in a cathartic manner. And they put it, I think we cut down that lead at the end of the game with a bunch of 3-point shooting from Harrison, but that game was more or less a blowout last year.
It was a blowout, and in that respect, there's been one competitive game between these two schools in the last 8 years. This second game, the first game in Raleigh in 2007 when Sidney Lowe broke out the red coat, that was the first time he did that. And they won it. They were up that game from the tip, but it was pretty close at the end. But other than that, we haven't seen a good game between these two schools in 8 years.
Yeah, I mean, last year's second game in Carolina was close. I think State had a lead in the second half, but then Carolina, probably for the last 15 minutes, went on a run and kind of sealed the game away. Yeah, it's tough to know because, I mean, State played really well. Or State started playing, they played horrible, but they started playing well in the second half against Carolina earlier this year. It still ended up being a blowout, but Desmond Lee was really being able to get into the paint well against Carolina's defense. But since then, Carolina's been playing a ton better. So it's tough to know because you're right. This does feel like this State team isn't bad. This isn't one of those teams that you just feel like Carolina is going to beat them just purely on talent.
All right, last year I'm looking at it. State definitely did not have a lead. Oh, no, they did for a little bit, actually. You're right. They went up for 3 or 4 there in the second half early.
Yeah.
But okay, point taken.
Yeah. But, I mean, even that game didn't have that tense of a – you kind of had a feeling Carolina was going to pull it out.
I guess that's my point is I almost just thought that was the case anyway.
Yeah. So, I mean, it'll be interesting to see with this game. I think it's definitely unless Carolina just has a complete, letdown game. Their other two games are at Virginia Tech and Notre Dame at home, and I don't think they should have problems with either of those. So yeah, State's really the only semi-hurdle before they play Duke again. So I
Let's
mean,
just for the last 5 minutes here, we've kind of meandered through a lot of this. Let's talk about the heels and a little bit of this in relation to the Duke game. But I guess what I've been saying for 2 years about Bryce, I think everyone's starting to pick up on it, that he's just a really good basketball player. Regardless of, his hands can seem a little weak at times. He's a little skinny, he disappears at times. But he's probably the most polished offensive player on the team right now. And Meeks, I think, is a really close second. I mean, I think these two guys are just fantastic. And it really confuses me how people aren't able to pick up on that a little bit quicker. That, okay, so Meeks is a freshman. He's going to get blocked at the rim several times. He's going to turn around and not jump enough because he's not used to having to do that, because he's not used against playing a guy's his size. Of course, that's going to happen. But he's obviously a really good basketball player. I've never really understood how people aren't able to compartmentalize that and say, all right, so he had 10 moves this game. 4 of them were really bad, but the 6 showed me that this guy's a really good basketball player. And I think some fans just look at it as 6 were good, 4 were bad. This guy is not a very good player, or he's okay, or he's mediocre. He really needs to make a jump. But you're talking about a freshman, and even with Johnson, you're talking about a sophomore who didn't get a lot of playing time last year. And I guess you could take that to next year and how solid this team's going to be. But
well, that was a point I went to the weight game this weekend, but that was a point I was making. I went with my friends and my brother, and it's funny because Carolina's team, they're playing really well. I'm not sure they're going to make a really deep run in the tournament, but they're looking like a dangerous team. At the same time, though, whether it be, most of it's actually physical reasons, but they have a bunch of players who are pretty good college players, probably produce on a similar level to some people who are going to go pro this year, but because of size or whatever, are almost guaranteed to be 3 or 4 year players. I mean, if Marcus Page is 6'4" and playing the way he does, he's going pro after this year. But he's, 6'1" and not extremely explosive. Kennedy Meeks, if Kennedy Meeks weighs 10 pounds less and is 2 inches taller, people are probably looking at him as a pick this year. Bryce Johnson, kind of same thing. If he was taller and maybe a little stronger, maybe the same thing there. But they have a lot of players. I mean, Tokido, same thing. Tokido is freakishly athletic, but isn't a great shooter yet and doesn't have that reputation. But we're looking at I feel like Carolina has a lot of very good players who are going to end up hanging around for a while. And I think you never know, but I feel like the next couple years they probably won't have these slow starts that they've had the past couple years. Anyways, one last thing I want to transition to, our one last thought on the Duke Syracuse thing, because now they've played both games of the regular season. They've both been games that came down to the wire with exciting endings. The whole Duke Syracuse rivalry thing has certainly gained some momentum. Do you think in part, this is kind of two thoughts. One, in part that's due just because the two styles those two schools play complement each other very well. When you have a zone, a true zone team like Syracuse with athletes, that can go inside on offense, versus a team like Duke who can actually shoot a zone team out of a zone, it generally tends to lead to interesting games and interesting style clashes. And I think that's in part why Duke Syracuse might just be kind of destined to be more of an exciting yearly matchup than Carolina Syracuse. But by the same token, when Louisville comes in next year, I almost feel like Louisville Carolina complement each other in a similar way to the way that Duke and Syracuse complement each other. Louisville kind of plays a pressing, frantic attack. Carolina plays, an up tempo, press breaking style. They like to run. And you saw already when those two teams played in that preseason tournament final that it was an exciting game. Carolina actually ended up beating them because they were able to run, past Louisville's press. Kennedy Meeks threw some long outlet passes on multiple occasions to break their press. So it's kind of interesting with those two teams being added. Carolina Duke, as much as people like to troll, is always going to be the biggest rivalry in the ACC. But as far as kind of basketball style, basketball purist rivalries, it seems like Syracuse and Duke seem to naturally match up kind of well together, and Louisville and Carolina do in a similar way.
That's actually a really good point. I had not thought of that. I think Carolina, Louisville, you have that on point. Well, you're right about Syracuse, Duke, but I would say that what that causes is exactly what we've seen. If Duke is hot, you're going to see 90-point games that are really fun, like the first one. If Duke is not hot, you're going to see 60-point games like we did last night. Which honestly, I thought that was a pretty shitty game. After, the first 10 minutes or the first 5 minutes were really high scoring, and it looked like this was going to be kind of a repeat of the other night. And then they essentially scored about 45 points each over the next 30 minutes, which just sucks, man. I'm just tired of watching basketball like this. And I don't know if it's because the level of the game has just declined so much because you don't have guys sticking around, or whether it's rules, the game has just gotten way too physical and nobody can move anywhere. I don't know, man. Some of the writers and myself were messing around on Twitter this morning talking about it. I don't know what the fix is, but it's got to happen. And whether it's the charge block thing needing to be more like the NBA, I mean, we could talk about that call just in relation. The NBA just doesn't call that. I think that's what a lot of people miss. All these people talking about it. Oh, is it a block? Is it a charge? Can we not agree that either one is terrible? I mean, the NBA, they just don't call it, and that's all right. So if you want to stand there and not actually play D, that's you're going to keep me out of the way of the rim just a little bit. But in general, if you do that, I'm going to get a good shot off, and that's pretty much how every other league runs with it. I think in high school they're going to call that a block every time, which I would always rather that be a block than a charge. But in general, arguing over whether it's a block and a charge just seems so absurd to me when we can agree that both are terrible calls.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very valid point. I mean, the charge block thing's always been kind of in the focus. I do think we are moving more. College basketball is moving more and more. Whether it be with the protected zone, with it be the new changes this year, they're starting to move more and more towards it. And I think eventually that will be part of it. I do think the other part. I think as far as low scoring, it's two things. It's one, exactly what you said. Kind of a talent drain of people leaving after 1 or 2 years. So that you don't have quite, you don't have the Vince Carters and Antoine Jamesons there their junior year. And I think the other thing too is that I feel like coaches now, a lot of like smaller school coaches have kind of started taking the approach that they can hang. They have a much better chance of hanging with a Carolina or Duke if they slow down the game. And I think the obvious fix there is to change the shot clock. Whether it be to, I don't think they'll move it all the way down to 24, but whether it be to 28 or 30. That's going to make more games up tempo, because you do see teams who are burning down the shot clock, on a more constant basis to try to minimize the number of possessions and make it easier to pull an upset.
Yeah, I'd like to see that. I'm a little surprised they haven't already done it, to be honest with you. The idea that the shot clock should be the same of what it was in 1988 seems a little absurd. But something's got to change. I know fans who are not, they're not fans. I know people who say, I don't like basketball. I don't like college basketball. And I say, why? And they say, I have no idea what's going on. Someone drives into the lane and everyone I'm watching the game with goes nuts, or they really like it, or they can't understand the call. And I don't understand the call. I'm speaking in the voice of someone who doesn't follow the game that much. And they're right. If you're a casual college basketball fan and you see a play like last night, you have not a clue why the ref is calling, why Hess is pointing one way or calling a block or a charge. You have no idea. And that's going to turn anyone off of anything. I mean, when you watch these Olympic sports and you have no idea what the rules are, you're less tuned in. And that's a problem. It's a serious issue. Not that my career is tied to the success of college basketball, but it does bum me out to see that stuff happening, and just generally see. You wonder if a lot of these guys, a lot of the Kobe's and LeBrons of the future, don't want to go to college and play in that crap. I cannot personally imagine playing basketball in that atmosphere when you have no idea what the hell the ref's going to call. That vine of the back-to-back Jabari and whoever it was for Syracuse making that charge, was it fair?
Benajay.
Benajay?
It was Fair who took it. And the second one was Fair driving.
Imagine trying to play basketball in those conditions. That's just incredible. Like, what does Boeheim tell his team? How do you coach that? How do you teach that? You don't. You got to cut it out. Austin Johnson, the writer for Pack Pride, had a good idea this morning, and not that this is his idea, but just said if you can work in the rules, some kind of the second defender, like no charges on a help defender. And I don't. Maybe there's probably not any language where you could actually write that into the rule book. But I'd like to see something like that. I've played basketball at a lot of levels, pretty much everything below college. I cannot imagine playing basketball like that. I really can't, and it's even weirder for me to watch it.
Yeah. No, I agree, and I mean it kind of brings us back. This Duke Syracuse, the rivalry thing. I mean, they had two good games, and really even the first one, there was a call on Jabari, where he kind of cleared out, and he did use his arm to clear out, but it's another instance where they called an offensive foul, and it was when he fouled out, I think in overtime or at the end of regulation. Um, and it sucks because you have, like we were talking about, Duke and Syracuse. One of the games is lower scoring, but this cool clash of styles. And instead of being the conversation is about what was this call. So I think that's unfortunate. All that said, this was an awesome week of basketball between the Duke UNC game. Even Carolina's comeback against Florida State was awesome. And then you had obviously the Duke Syracuse game, which it's tougher to know honestly which one of those games, especially because of the way it ended controversially. It's tough to know which one of those games is, I guess the Syracuse Duke game is considered the bigger game in some ways. Obviously, Duke Carolina has a big rivalry aspect of it, but it's weird having a week with that many big games so close together. So, and the nice thing is that you'll get that again in the ACC tournament, and it's going to be an exciting lead up over the next couple weeks into the ACC tournament.
Yeah. It was a hell of a week, enough to force us into podcasting. So
yeah,
here it is.
Good stuff, man. Well, should probably end it here, but sounds good. Yeah.